Well, what?
That's as loud as you could crack it. It's just a noisy racket.
That's the sleepy sign.
All right. Welcome to the Radical Parenting Podcast. My name is Tony Shawcross.
Hey, everybody. I'm Kara Porbaugh.
Well, if you haven't watched previous episodes, we've read a lot of parenting books, and we talk about parenting books. A couple of them we just talk about general philosophies and thoughts from radical parenting, radical honesty, the work on which this podcast rotates around. But we also have done conversations with some other radical honesty practitioners and parents who reflect the radical parenting kind of ideals and the ideals of what I call prime directive parenting, which is just kind of as much non-interference as possible. And then we did an episode, I think the last episode was children's books, which is a lot of fun. And today we're going to be reviewing a book or an essay that's not about parenting at all. It does touch on children, but it's a big foundation of my personal philosophy. And actually, it's written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and my partner chose my son's first name. I got to choose his middle name. His middle name is Emerson, and this essay has a lot to do with why I wanted our child to be named Emerson.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to just get into it. The essay is called Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's really short, but it's also not an easy read. I'm not a great reader anyway. I usually listen to our books on tape instead of reading them, but this doesn't exist on tape. And if it does, it wouldn't work for me anyway, because it's just so dense and the language is so unfamiliar to me. But it's worth the work. It's worth the effort. And this was your first time reading it, right, Kara?
Yeah. And I wasn't sure. I had no idea what it was going to be like. I wasn't even sure, why you had chosen it for a parenting podcast. And then I started reading, and I just sort of jaw-dropping. I love it. And it's it's like a manifesto on radical honesty, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and on true nature and non-duality. And yeah, I loved it. I'm so glad we're talking about it.
Great. Me too. Well, I'll get us started, and we'll just bounce back and forth. And the essay isn't really structured, in my opinion, very well. So our review of it probably won't be incredibly well structured either. So we'll just kind of bounce back and forth. But if I had to say what sticks out for me as like the primary message of self-reliance, it's this core idea that we as humans, our brains and our bodies, are the products of billions of years of evolution. And Emerson wasn't really a follower of any kind of institutionalized religion, but he definitely believed in God and believed in the divinity of nature and by extension the divinity of us and everything kind of created in nature. And I think one of the core messages is that there's just so much capacity within us, and that babies and children have access to this inherent wisdom that's instilled in us by this universe and in his mind by God, that adults have forgotten and buried under years of other forms of acquired wisdom, but lose this inherent wisdom. And to me, this essay is just like a plea to everyone to just cling to this wisdom that is born into us and is right there, that we trade away for acceptance and for other kind of ego reasons. And it's just begging us as humans to hold on to that individuality and that wisdom that we have. There's this bumper sticker I saw. I'd never heard the quote before, but a Robin Williams quote that I think I've referenced in this podcast before, that says something like, if you only have one piece of weirdness in you, cling to it like it's a life preserver. If you have that one piece of uniqueness, hold on to it. Yeah, I feel a little teary-eyed just talking about it. I like this piece a lot, and it also just feels like a permission to me to be myself. I think we want We want permission to be ourselves. We want to be accepted, not because of our performances and our ability to fit in and our ability to be accepted by others. We want to be accepted just for who we are. And this feels like a permission to me to be bold and to be yourself, and to let the lack of acceptance that will come with that happen, and a reassurance that what acceptance you do find in yourself and from others is just going to mean that much more to you and to the world. So that's kind of my intro. And yeah, as we've learned radical honesty, I don't think Brad reveres this text as much as I do, and as much as a lot of other texts that Brad Blanton, the founder of Radical Honesty and author of Radical Parenting, I don't think he reveres this text as much, though I've talked to him about it. He has read it. But it just, so much of what he teaches and writes about is reflected in this so strongly.
Yeah, I was reminded of him over and over and over again. I mean, he almost could have written this. It so reminds me of Brad. Thanks, Tony. I think it's beautiful what you said about the self-acceptance. And, he never uses those words. He doesn't use those words, but he talks about the nature of our existence is like a single ray of sunlight from the greater source of, he uses all kinds of different words. He does say God sometimes, but it's like, what people might call true nature, or the wisdom of all being and the connectedness of all being, and that our innermost impulses that are not reasonable or sophisticated or conditioned, that those are wise and sacred. And he even talks about being obedient to them. It's like a different kind of obedience. I found that so interesting. He talks about obedience and faith rather than to some external dogma or creed, an obedience to our own spontaneous whims, which he says isn't the best word, but and I think by whim he's talking about that instinct and that intuition that comes through us. It's not really created by us. It's just sort of like
born into us.
Vessel. And then we make these children who are such vessels, and then we spend our whole lives trying to train that out of them.
Yeah. And I love how one thing that I didn't think of that so echoes Brad's teaching that just came up as you were talking is just like his permission to get it wrong, like his permission to not be right and not be consistent from one day to the next. Like, speak your loud, rude truth today, and tomorrow, if it's different, speak it just as loudly as you did yesterday. Brad always says if it's worth doing, it's worth doing wrong, or things like that, where he's just like always trying to get people to express without attachment to being right or how it'll play out or whatever.
Right. It's like we can attune to like whatever's moving right now, and that might contradict everything that happened before. And but if it's moving right now in us, there's some truth there. There's something alive there.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a little quote on this kind of topic of this kind of divinity of human nature. And I'm going to put it up on the screen as well. And again, this is really dense language, so it's not that easy to follow, but I'm going to read it and we'll take it slow. And I liked this passage. It says, "We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, whilst all later teachings are tuitions," so distinct from intuition, tuitions. "In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. For the sense of being which in calm hours rises, we know not how, in the soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one with them, and proceeds obviously from the same source whence their life and being also proceed." I'm going to pause here for a second and just say that most people that I know that have done like a 7-day meditation retreat or an 8-day radical honesty retreat, or, any of these kind of like transformative things, just hiked the Pacific Coast Trail or any of these things, like when they talk about their moments of clarity, Samuel L. Jackson refers to moments of clarity in Pulp Fiction. When they talk about like their insights, some people do it through hallucinogenics, whatever. To me, it always rotates around this theme, this idea that we are not diverse from space, from time, from man. We are just like one. We are part of all of this. And to let like institutions or fears or whatever, ego, kind of drown out that light that is in us is just like a crime to humanity, a crime to ourselves, and a crime to the people that we come across. Feel free to jump in at any point if you want to, Kara. Otherwise, I'll just go on reading.
Yeah, I just want to say that, I mean, this is essentially, this could be straight out of a Buddhist text, right? I mean, this is about awakening to the oneness of all being, right?
Yeah.
And like non-duality and non-separation.
Yeah. Great. So it says, we first share the life by which things exist, and afterwards see them as appearances in nature, and forget that we have shared their cause. Yeah, I feel like crying. Here's the foundation of action and thought. Here are the lungs of that inspiration. Can you read it?
Yeah.
Here are the lungs of that inspiration which giveth man wisdom, and which cannot be denied without impiety and atheism. We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves, but allow a passage to its beams. The relation of the soul to the divine spirit are so pure that it is profane to seek to interpose helps. So, I mean, it's really just repeating the same thing Kara and I were just saying. It's just like, let that, like shine through you. So for me, that's kind of the core message of, if you wanted to read the Cliff's Notes of Self-Reliance, that's kind of the Cliff's Notes. But then he goes into a lot more kind of like specifics around everything from like the need for entertainment to children and the wisdom of babies and all of that. So we're going to get into all these different topics. But for me, this core message of like the divinity of human nature is the core idea behind it. And you have to filter out a few things. Like he always talks about man and means mankind.
But
he
I crossed out a few of those and like rewrote my own
good
pronouns or whatever.
Yeah, he's not a flawless sage, but there's a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, and so this brings up something for me about my own, parenting dilemmas and struggles about, and I think this might be more true for me than for you, Tony. I might be more of a people pleaser. So I believe that the way that our children are going to learn this is not by us talking about it or giving some kind of lecture or whatever. It's more so going to come from modeling it within ourselves. So the way for me to support this in my daughter is to actually stand so strongly in my own self-acceptance and my own inner impulses, and that I'm modeling that for her when I do that, even if it might be edgy sometimes. It might be saying no, for me. So I don't want to fall into the trap of like putting our children up on this pedestal where like, they're just perfect and can do no wrong, and they're these godlike creatures, and then we're like down here, like adults who ruin everything, right? It's like, No, actually, my strength in myself is going to bump up against her strength in herself. And we're going to have all of this, in a really intimate relationship, like a parent and a child. We're going to have lots of edginess. We're going to have conflict. We're going to have, dilemmas. We're going to have lots of grist for the mill, right? And I guess that's my own path, I feel like, is to not sacrifice myself for what I believe is the model of being a perfect mother or whatever. So if I think that I should do this or that, the other, but I actually am feeling I'm not willing to, then I do believe it's a gift to her to be completely genuine and congruent about that of no, this is, I take care of myself as
Mm-hmm.
well as taking care of you. And I trust you to be, this kind of goes back to some of the Janet Lansbury stuff that we were talking about of like I trust you to be a self-reliant, force of nature, that it's okay to feel disappointed and to be mad at me. And I do teach my daughter to say that she's mad at me, um, instead of, kicking or hitting or calling names. I say, like, you're so, like, yeah, I'm not going to let you kick me. And you can scream and shout and tell me how mad at me you are as much as you want. So there's like a strength in that of standing in my conviction, even when it appears to be um, unsupported in some way, or it doesn't fit into sort of the nurturing mother fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think a lot of people are now realizing is really dangerous for moms.
I don't know how gender plays in a lot, but it does seem a lot more normal for women and young girls to quiet this even a little bit more, to young girls like Elsie Jane's age. She's got no problem with this. She's like in perfect attunement with Ralph Waldo Emerson's plea. But it does seem like it gets pushed out of women a bit more than men and boys. And I think part of that is, I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't necessarily think I think it's more nurture than nature, if you ask me. But it's certainly, the case for you. Like you said, you're more of a caretaker than I am. You're more of a people pleaser than I am. And it's part of the reason when my partner thought we were going to have a girl, why I was especially excited. I just think the kind of radical parenting that we're talking about, the kind of someone who's like really in tune with the feelings and sensations that others have, but don't carry that like a weight on them, don't take responsibility for it, but can make a choice at any moment. Like, I recognize that these other people are feeling this way. I recognize even that I'm having an impact on how they're feeling, but I get to choose in any moment whether I want to let that kind of steer the ship or let my inner compass kind of steer the ship, come what may with other people, because you're going to rub people the wrong way. That more out loud you live, the more people you're going to ruffle their feathers. It's just inevitable. And so many of us are not willing to do it. And it's somehow might even be less acceptable when women do it, which is why I'm so happy I have a son. He's perfect. And I still hope to someday have a daughter and have her say F all that,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Fierce little girls.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So because this is the Radical Parenting Podcast, I do want to talk about the parts of the essay where he's talking about childhood. So I'm going to share the screen again, and we're going to again read some kind of dense language. But I love this section. So he says, infancy conforms to nobody. All conform to it. So that one babe commonly makes 4 or 5 out of the adults who prattle and play to it. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So God has armed youth and puberty and manhood no less with its own piquancy and charm, and made it enviable and gracious, and its claims not to be put by if it will stand by itself. I don't want to decode that for everyone, but it's just that same message. Do not think the youth has no force, because he cannot speak to you and me. Hark, in the next room his voice is sufficiently clear and emphatic. It seems he knows how to speak to his contemporaries. Bashful or bold, then, he will know how to make us seniors very unnecessary. I'm going to keep going. The nonchalance of boys who are sure of a dinner and would disdain as much as a lord to do or say aught to conciliate one is the healthy attitude of human nature. So again, like a boy that's interested in eating has no reverence to even a lord. A boy is in the parlor what the pit is in the playhouse, independent, irresponsible, looking out from his corner on such people and facts as pass by. He tries and sentences them on their merits in the swift, summary way of boys, as good, bad, interesting, silly, eloquent, troublesome. He cumbers himself never about consequences, about interests. He gives an independent, genuine verdict. You must court him, he does not court you. But the man is, as it were, clapped into jail by his consciousness. So he's saying, unlike a boy, a young boy, a grown man is clapped into jail by his consciousness, our consideration of all of everyone else's thoughts and opinions and feelings. As soon as he has once acted or spoken with éclat, I forget how you pronounce this word. I looked up the pronunciation, but it means acting in a way that's specifically seeking approval. He is a committed person, watched by the sympathy or hatred of hundreds, whose affections must now enter into his account. I'm going to just say that again. Unlike a boy, the man is clapped into jail by his consciousness. As soon as he has once acted or spoken with éclat, I forget, he is a committed person, seeking approval. He's a committed person, watched by the sympathy or hatred of hundreds, whose affections must now enter into his account. There is no lathe for this. I looked that word up
like
too.
the river where you drink the water and you forget. So like
Right.
there's no
There's
forgetting.
no way to forget it. Once this is your focus. And sorry, I'm going to pause here too, because one of the concepts that's been really hard for me to reflect and was totally foreign to me that Janet Lansbury said, that Magda Gerber said, that
Alfie Kohn.
Alfie Kohn said, is like not to praise your children, to watch them and let them enjoy their activities for their own intrinsic value. And this is speaking to that too. Like when we praise our children, they become seeking that praise. And
that's so
it's
that's
so
right
hard.
Where I was going with it too, Tony, because like forget the masses or the hundreds of people. We are like gods in our children's eyes, and our sympathy or our hatred, our any little hint of like approval or disapproval is earth-shattering for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to train our kids to watch for that approval or disapproval with everything that they do. Yeah. And it's going to happen anyway, some of the time. But it's like a lot of systems of being with children, teaching and parenting, it's all about positive reinforcement or words and punishments or whatever, where we're purposely trying to shape their behavior with our punishment or with our disapproval or approval. Yeah. So we're very much trying to like totally stay out of that game.
Yeah. And it's the hardest for me. I mean, I have such limited time with my son right now that I just want him to know how much I love him. Like I love him so much, and I just want him to know that. And same with my nieces and nephews. I mean, my time with them is rarer than I'd like. And it just comes so naturally to me to just to gush all over them. And even Arlo, like just the little things, like all that development, he's only 9 months now. So all that development, every time I see him, it's something new. Like his hands work so good right now. And like he was having trouble like picking up his pacifier or anything like that before. And now he can just like grab anything, and kind of like his hands work so good. And I just can't help it but like lavish praise on him for what a good job, for how good his hands work. And I have to just remind myself
But
every
is
time
it praise, or is it, because I don't think there's anything wrong with communicating your genuine excitement. I mean, if you try to stamp that down, then that's going to be incongruent. Where
Yeah.
it's like, you know what I mean? Like, I really believe it's okay to just describe,
Yeah.
like, you couldn't do that last time I saw you, and now you're grabbing the pacifier.
Yeah. But in
That's
a way,
new.
like
That's, you know,
that Janet Lansbury mentions that it's like, it's a little bit like selfish, like, especially when they're really into whatever they're doing, that you make it about you and like your thing
yeah,
instead of just like standing by and just like getting the
right.
joy you have by watching them.
So I think she says, wait,
Mm,
don't do it when they're involved in their own
mm,
fascination with something. But if they look to you
mm-hmm.
for a response, you can be there in it with them,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been
In
trying to,
fact, yeah, like no response is, I mean, that's its own kind of response, right?
yeah, no, I
So
mean,
we're not
I'll
going
sit
for
there
like,
smiling. Yeah, I'm not even aiming for no response, but I am looking for other ways. Like a lot of just like, I see you, I see what you're doing. A lot of the sports
yeah,
casting stuff,
yeah,
I
totally.
love watching it. But yeah, it's going to be a new muscle for me, and that's most of the things that we've read about in most of these books. It's almost like this one. It just emboldens me to like be how I want to be anyway. That's the one thing that's like, no, that would have maybe
Uh-huh.
never occurred to me.
That like good job is
Hmm.
actually not all that helpful. Yeah.
But
Well,
it makes so
I
much
really
sense.
appreciate you for saying like I don't know what you said, but it's like a new vocabulary. It's we don't talk this way in our culture, so we have to basically practice and train ourselves to speak a completely different way, in a descriptive way instead of a evaluating way.
Yeah.
And I think it's really helpful to do that description, because that they know that, like, yes, I'm not just saying that I saw you, but I actually was there with you in that, really understanding what that meant for you. And here's what it meant for me. And
Yeah.
um, that detail of description is a way that we can be really close, I imagine, of like, yes, I'm right here and I see every detail of that experience and I can even describe it in words. And then they really get that we are paying attention.
Hmm. Yeah. Awesome. All right, I'm going to finish this little
Yeah.
passage about children. This is pretty much the only part of the essay where he's directly talking about kids. So yeah, there is no way to forget this, essentially. That he could pass again into his neutrality. So it's like once we've learned to be worried about other people's opinions and responses, like, oh, that we could pass back into that neutrality, who can thus avoid all pledges, and having observe again from the same unaffected, unbiased, unbribable, unaffrighted innocence, must
Mm,
always be formidable.
mm,
So he's saying like these kids are unaware, they're oblivious to these judgments from others, and that's not what we're going for. We're going for, you develop theory of mind, different studies say you can see the world from the perspective of others, and thus have kind of from my opinion, where all morality evolves, and where all everything that's about good and evil to me comes from this ability to view the world from other people's perspectives. A lion that can't view the world from a deer's perspective, it's not evil for him to kill the deer. But I'm going off on a little bit of a rabbit hole, but he's saying like we want to to know, we want to observe, we want to have observed the feelings of others and the judgments of others and the condemnation of others even, and yet still observe that from this unaffected, unbiased, unbribable, unaffrighted innocence, and how formidable that is if you can say, yeah, I know that I'm getting condemned for this. I know that people judge me or think I'm whatever, vain, or think I'm whatever they think, and I'm still doing it because it's what's coming from my heart. And I think a lot of people have a lot of fear about this. This comes up when I've done like landmark education or whatever, that like if we drop these rules about like what it means to be good or bad, that we would become so so like unethical. But this was the first quote that I ever came across with Ralph Waldo Emerson. A lot of you guys are familiar with this. You got it in some like college graduation card or something. But Ralph Waldo Emerson's kind of like idea of success, his famous quote about success includes this piece: to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know that even one life is breathed easier because you have lived, that is to have succeeded. So this isn't someone who then ends up, in like a selfish phase or whatever. This isn't someone who doesn't care about others. And for me, that's not the result of it either. When you're really true to yourself, we are just evolved to be communal creatures. We are evolved to help each other. Cavemen who didn't want to help each other, wanted to truly be an island and didn't care about other people's pain and suffering, they had a disadvantage in evolution. And I think it's just inherent to all of us that we want to maximize joy. We want to minimize suffering. We want to help each other. And a lot of these shoulds and morality and these other motivations warp that as much as they shape it in the right direction. And in my opinion, they warp it and shape it in the wrong direction a lot more than they shape it in the right direction. So for me, go ahead.
Well, I want to talk about that thing right there, about how do our very best, he talks a lot about this in the essay. How does our very best attempt at, conveying morality, teaching and learning morality, how does that go awry and actually undermine our compassionate instincts? He doesn't specifically talk about that, but he talks a lot about something that that Brad, the founder of Radical Honesty, says all the time, which is that once something is made into a rule and it's hardened and calcified, it's no longer true. What's true in this moment is no longer true in the next moment. And so Emerson talks a lot about that, that the most genuine, spontaneous arising of truth or goodness, that as soon as that is turned into, he talks a lot about history, right? Of like, as soon as we start to revere, like exact words of these exact people and think that that is the truth and the only truth, then it loses its truth. And that the truth is, these are my words, not his, the truth is alive and constantly changing. And that it's like, the light from the sun will enter everywhere. And, and this ray of light and this ray of light and this ray of light, we think belongs to those people or those churches or whatever. And that all of those things are, as the Buddhist saying goes, are just fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon, or like Brad often says, the map is not the territory, or the menu is not the meal. So I found that really relevant in terms of parenting, because, here we are doing a podcast, we're reading books, we're talking about parenting philosophies. I have certain parenting gurus that I revere and respect. And that is useful to me. Learning and reading and listening to people that I trust, that's really useful to me. And in the moment when I am challenged with an experience with my child, there is no script, there is no rule, there is no philosophy that is going to come in and save me. Things go better generally when I step out of that, well, I'm going to say this, and then she's going to do that, and then everything's going to be worked out. I actually have to be with her as a person, as a human. And I actually have to see her as her own being and her own
Independent, yeah,
totally like separate person from me, so that I can relate to her, and we can have this back and forth, but I cannot really do anything to her. So as soon as I sort of slip into that tempting track of like, I'm the parent and I'm going to do something to you,
mold. Mm-hmm.
She will make very sure that to make that difficult for me, for which I'm really grateful, because I do have to come back over and over and over again to, okay, it's not about anything that I believe or some like fantasy about how this is gonna go or should go, or wishing that my child would make things easier for me. That's not her job. It's relating to, then I hope I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense. It's hard to put into words. It's a shift where I can feel myself shifting to like, okay, I'm just here now with you and with myself, and staying with, even if I'm frustrated or whatever, and something comes out of that, something that I might not be able to predict or script or problem solve. It's not really a problem solving thing. That's when my own intuition will drop in, of like being able to communicate or relate in a way where something shifts and we're no longer locked in a power struggle or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Does that, am I describing anything that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, it touches on so many aspects of this essay and of radical honesty, but Brad sometimes references Wilhelm Reich's work and this idea that that if you don't give things like a direct release, that they find like these convoluted ways out. And yeah, I like what you're really getting at though is that message that adhering to rules, even rules that come out of like our most wise moments, is a way of avoiding the here and now. It's a way of clinging to this past idea and not being here in the present. Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about the rose that like is a sapling or a bud, and then it beautiful blooms, and then it dies, and it doesn't yearn for that time when it was in bloom, and it doesn't, it's in perfect accord in every moment, and that's what we want to be aiming for. Not like, oh, I had this wisdom, and so I'm gonna kind of rely on that or whatever. But in the moment, what are you experiencing? What's going on in your body? What thoughts are you having? What's going on like right now? And if you let that stuff out instead of repressing it and saying, nope, here was the wise Kara or Tony of 2018, and here's what I decided I was going to do. Right. That's a way of avoiding, well, maybe that's not what's up for me right now. This is what's up for me. And if I deny that, first, Emerson's saying there's probably some wisdom in there, even if that's from trauma, even if that's from some need, unmet need, whatever. And if you just act on that directly, that it comes and goes. And you just say, this is what I'm dealing with now. I'm not feeling enlightened. I'm feeling like smashing my fists against the wall or something like that. That then you allow yourself to feel like smashing your fists against the wall. There's a limit, of course, to what we allow ourselves to do, especially when it comes to kids, but you allow yourself to do what comes naturally to you. And then those feelings come and go. And it's that much easier to just be kind of, present and in the moment.
Yeah.
One of my core values, and it's up on the wall here at my work, is honoring your word. And things work so much better in a workplace and in relationships when you can count on what people have said. And I did really like that this essay is talking about that's not the highest aim here. Like, be true to yourself in the moment. And
even if it totally contradicts what you said yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that the reality of that in some ways is going to be more consistent than if you're clinging to like honoring your word, that the consistency of the nature and the divinity of all of us will provide like a consistency and a dependability that is truer than any kind of like, oh, I'm honoring my word. I promised I would do this, and so now I'm going to do it. And that is still something that's important to me, but it's not a rule. And I want to check in with myself and say, do I still feel this way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved that image that he gave. It took me a little while to grasp what he was talking about, but he talks about, a ship, the best journey of the best ship is actually like a collection of a million little zigzags. And if you stand back, and from a distance, you chart the journey, it looks like a straight line, but actually it was tons of little zigzags. That also reminded me so much of Brad, where it's like everything is a process of noticing and adjusting and noticing again and adjusting and attuning to what, rather than taking one rigid path.
It's just good to question everything always. It's just good to, question it always. And radical honesty would say, and I think Ralph Waldo Emerson might too, although he doesn't really say in the essay, use your body as the barometer, that in this moment, pay attention to your body, and that there is just some like wisdom in what's going on in your body.
There's one more thing I want to go back to.
Yeah.
He used the word nonchalant, and that I love that, and I judge that as very important. That nonchalance. It's similar to Janet Lansbury talks about being unruffled, or like another favorite parenting guide is Susan Stiffelman, and she talks about being amused and indifferent. I think there's a certain amount of healthy detachment where we really allow our kids to have all of their, wild fantasies and their intense emotions and all of that. And that we just don't take it on that much. Like, it's not so deadly serious. That nonchalance thing is like super important for me personally, like in my sort of rabid devotion to like being the best parent that I can be, and to like analyzing every sentence that I say to my child and stuff like that. I also need, I think, a healthy dose of like not taking it all too seriously.
Yeah.
And not taking myself too seriously. And I can trust that as a very devoted and nurturing parent, that's okay, that there's something to be gained. I imagine I'm not expressing myself very well here.
No, you are totally.
Something to be gained by just allowing things to be and not getting so attached to the outcome, basically,
And it is hard too as a single parent. I think when you're parenting together, and again, I don't want to be gendered, but it is often, there's at least the stereotype that the men can kind of just be the fun one, and the men can kind of just like sometimes not stress about this or that in the relationship, and the mom has to kind of like make sure that there's actual diapers in the diaper bag and stuff like that. And I totally hear what you're saying. You could just do like the most perfect parenting job and then 16 years from now be beating yourself up because you have just such an uptight child, because you were so uptight about doing everything perfectly, and you did it all perfectly except for whatever. And it is so nice when you can be parenting it as a couple and maybe even trade that off, and your child gets to see that, yeah, we don't always have to have everything perfect or figured out or whatever. We can show up with too few diapers and improvise and see what happens. We can whatever.
Totally. Yeah. And that's so beautiful, I think, for a child to have a few really attached sources of attachment figures. Because I do put a lot of pressure on myself as her main attachment figure.
Yeah.
That like I've got to be all things with her. I need to be like the fun parent who like we laugh and play, and also the one who like is responsible for the details of whatever, packing the lunch and changing the diaper.
Yeah.
And that's a lot. That's too much for anybody.
When I was young, my parents were very social, and they had a few like really close friends, and a lot of them made significant impact on me. I remember the Arroyo family. The dad, Tony Arroyo, died recently, but he was just so nonchalant in his interaction with me. And even as like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old kid, he was just like totally inappropriate and would talk about drugs, because it was the 70s or early 80s, and he was a pothead, and so he talked about marijuana with like a 6-year-old kid, and he would talk about whatever,
which
we
don't necessarily recommend,
right?
Yeah.
And he would curse and like very casually use profanity in his language with me, even as like an 8-year-old or something like that. And I remember thinking like, I want to be like that. Like, I trust this person. This person is not putting on airs around me. This person is not acting around me. This person is just who he is around me. And I felt like special and let in that he would talk to me in the same way that I heard him talking to my parents and adults. And I wanted to be like him.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Tony. And I appreciate you for crying, for tearing up. Yeah, I think it's such, kids get a lot of this, protection racket, and some of that is really necessary and appropriate. I am gonna protect my kid from like seeing violent images on TV or whatever that she cannot unsee and that are really scary, and I'm gonna protect her from certain things, but on a human level, like there's a way that we communicate kids that sort of like puts them in bubble wrap of like that we think that we have to be so careful with them or something. And there's a huge gift in like trusting and respecting. They can handle themselves and stand on their own 2 feet, and I can handle myself and stand on my own 2 feet. And that's when we can actually relate and have a relationship that doesn't involve, well, I need you to be this way and I need you to be that way. I don't know quite how I got there from what you were talking about.
I'm glad you saved me. Give me a minute to compose myself.
Okay, which you don't have to do, by the way.
Thanks. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. I want to read again from the essay. You can see my screen, yeah, Kara?
Yep.
So there's this line. He says, "The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution. The only wrong, what is against it. A man is to carry himself in the presence of all opposition, as if everything were titular and ephemeral but he. I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. Every decent and well-spoken individual affects and sways me more than is right. I ought to go upright and vital and speak the rude truth in all ways." That's probably one of the easier to digest paragraphs of his. I don't think I need to explain any of that.
I want to add something here. So I wrote in my notes when I read this, the Stanley Milgram experiments. That's what that reminded me of. So anyone who's listening, if you don't know about the Stanley Milgram experiments, look those up. And actually, so Brad Blanton gives a really good description of it is it in Practicing Radical Honesty?
I think so, yeah.
I think it's in Practicing Radical Honesty. He gives a really good description of it. And basically, it's just about how people in this experiment were willing to give higher and higher volts of shocks to someone to the point where the person appeared to be dead. And just normal people from a college campus were willing to do that because someone in a white lab coat said the experiment must go on. This was an experiment that was designed out of the war crimes trials after World War II. So the question is, how do we want to raise our children? Because, I would like my child to not be disruptive in a restaurant or not to say rude things to grandma or whatever. There's a dangerous dilemma there. We don't want to teach our children to always be polite and deferential. It's appropriate sometimes to say, no, I am not going to do that. And I don't care who you are. I'm not doing it.
Mm-hmm. And that's why for me, I don't want to teach rules. I want to teach practicing recognizing facial expressions, practicing recognizing emotions and other people as a language that my child and a vocabulary that my child speaks better than English. I think it's such an advantage, but it's also, to me, the only source of right and wrong. If we never practice thinking that, most kids will get it anyway, but the more we practice that, the more we can just trust that our children will see pain and suffering when it exists and not want to contribute to it. And the trick for me is just going to be helping raise a child that's so in tune with that and yet doesn't take responsibility for all of it. I want it to be a choice, not an obligation. Most of the time, I think they're going to choose the option that maximizes joy and minimizes suffering in the world. But I still think the best way to do it is just to make sure they have that tool and that skill and then just step back.
Right. So it comes from a place of noticing and attunement rather than from some rule that we conform to. Our minds go to, well, if we don't have rules and we don't have, rules of conduct and manners or whatever, morals and values, then, the whole world will just spin off its axis and people will be clubbing each other in the streets, right? And so, I don't think that's true. That's what we're saying is we don't believe that that's our true nature. That's not what comes out when we stop oppressing ourselves. Yeah. And he talks about for nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure, and therefore a man, an adult, must know how to estimate a sour face. The bystanders look askance on him in the public street or in the friend's parlor. And by the way, this happens a lot if you're parenting in a non-traditional way. If this aversation, which I assume means aversion, had its origin in contempt and resistance like his own, he might well go home with a sad countenance. But the sour faces of the multitude, like their sweet faces, have no deep cause, but are put on and off as the wind blows and a newspaper directs. So this is, I think what he's saying is this, like in that other quote that you read, the labels of good and bad can be sort of put on anything and changed around. And he's saying, if this aversion had its origin in contempt and resistance like his own, he might well go home with a sad countenance. But the sour faces of the multitude, like their sweet faces, have no deep cause, but are put on and off as the wind blows and a newspaper directs. Which is very similar to what he said about the labels of good and bad. They can be applied to this and then that, as convention sees fit. But what I'm really interested in is the first part. If this aversion had its origin in contempt and resistance like his own, he might well go home with a sad countenance. Which to me, I took that, my interpretation is what you're saying, Tony, about noticing. Like when we genuinely have an emotion in response to someone else's action, they're not responsible for my feeling. And yet I can say, I'm joyful or frustrated or this or that or whatever, or I feel tension in my body, or I feel relaxed and open. And all of that has impact on somebody else. And that is a true way of regulating ourselves, for lack of a better word. So that's how we regulate ourselves without rules and without emotions. It's by actually being present. We're repeating ourselves. It always comes back to this, right? It's about actually being present to what am I experiencing right now? What are you experiencing right now? And allowing ourselves to be moved by that.
Yeah. An example of that for me is when I was growing up, I used to love this baseball cap that I wore. And my parents probably suffered the outcome of not being very traditional in any way, because when we went into instances where like it's rude to wear a baseball cap, it was so foreign to me, and I was completely unwilling to do it. I was unwilling to take it off. And it's I think it relates to what you're saying. It's just like it had the displeasure that people had from me wearing a hat in these settings had no relation to my own ideas of right and wrong, my own ideas of like what's harmful and what's insulting and what's nice and mean. It was just too foreign to me. And yeah, so I didn't want to do it, and I still, whatever. Yeah, I was whipped for that nonconformity, figuratively.
Yeah. And again, it's like that could be appropriate or inappropriate depending on the context, right? Like maybe it's rude to wear a baseball cap in church, but it would be rude to maybe go into a synagogue without a head covering. I don't know about a baseball cap, but it's like whatever is labeled as inappropriate is, and this happens so often for children, right? It's like we label something as inappropriate, and because they just don't give a two hoots about that stuff. And so they're constantly doing inappropriate things. And it's really, we have to really look at like, well, what is the point of this manner or route? And I will say, it's possible that I'm somewhat contradicting myself. And I have never cared about manners in my whole life until now, because I have a person who lives in my house with me who would really like to order me around and have everything that she wants right at the moment when she wants it. And she's very self-reliant in terms of getting what she wants on her own, but she often will ask me for things. And I now see that there is a genuine reaction for me of like, no, I'm not willing to do certain things when I'm asked in a demanding way. And so it's not so, I hope that as she and I sort of like experiment and explore and play around with this, that it's not about being nice or being polite or following a rule about decorum, but that it's just very specific to the circumstance of like, will you please get whatever for me? I'm more likely to be willing. And that's just a real genuine thing that has come up that I didn't expect, because it kind of goes against all of my philosophy. But it's what's happening,
Great. Yeah. So Emerson tells you to trust that
Yeah.
cringe in your stomach that says, I don't know if I want to get you a drink when that's the way you're asking me for it or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more impulse about that. I feel
Mhm.
even hesitant to say this, but I feel like there's so much fine-tuned intuition that we need as parents. Like when my kid is upset, you know, I think that I can detect differences between like, you know, really genuine sorrow and disappointment and frustration and anger and all kinds of things. And there are times when I really feel the impulse to empathize. And then there are times where there's a certain like uh I don't want to say anything like negative here. There's a certain like whininess to it that I don't want to engage with. And I can judge myself for not being empathetic. And I actually think that there's a healthy impulse there of distinguishing between some sort of like something that's not completely congruent in her, you know, that I'm not going to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it does make sense. And I don't know. Yeah, I think especially when you're doing it just in a way that's just being true to your response, and you're not necessarily trying to mold her into the proper young girl who says her P's and Q's or whatever,
Yeah.
but you're just kind of trusting this thing that happens in you. And even if it's you know, I read this thing once that said like trauma is often mistaken for intuition or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not part of like the divine wisdom that's instilled in you by this perfect 200 billion years of evolution or whatever, even if it is a result of he talks about like, if I'm a child of the devil, then I'll act from the devil or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's you. That's the truth for you, and you are important
Yeah.
to her, and you are in her
Yeah.
life. And so, if that's the response you have, then be true to it. And I also think that who knows, that might end up dissipating for you. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like it's a little counterintuitive to trust that like I'm so ready and willing to empathize so much of the time. And every once in a while I have this impulse to like, mm, I'm just gonna kind of stay detached from this
Mm-hmm.
one. And there's no, I'm not trying to get into like, it's not okay to cry or be, or whiny or be anything. Um, it might just be a moment where I'm like, I think she's hungry. I'm going to focus on like handing her a snack.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing for this moment, rather
Mm-hmm.
than to like sit with her and cry and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
which we do at other moments. And it's like
Yeah.
having that attuned response of like, there's different, every moment that calls for something different, I imagine.
Yeah. And if you did want to be consistent, I am going to argue that it's that self-sacrifice of not listening to yourself that has the pendulum swing back and forth,
Yeah.
where you're like sacrificing and then you're like, no, I'm standing my ground. Whereas if you're just like aiming for that balance of just like listening to yourself, and if it feels inconsistent, it feels inconsistent, but the consistency is in here.
Yeah, I
I
like
think
that.
you'll end up with a level of consistency that is wiser than your brain is. Your brain
Mm-hmm.
isn't wise enough to
Right.
manipulate when you're going to react and positively and negatively. You can't keep track of that, but your body has this divine wisdom where it can.
Yeah, I so appreciate you for saying that there is a consistency in following that intuition. And it doesn't do anyone any good for me to give in a sacrificing way or in a way that is negating myself, because then I do feel resentful and whatever, and the pendulum swings. And so if I'm empathizing out of obligation or because that's the right thing to do, then it's not a gift to her.
Yeah.
It's not helping either one of us.
Yeah, and the one time I'm going to want to put the brakes on is when I find myself, we've been taught and even maybe born into us to kind of like control others, and again, like I want to be honest about my response to my child's tone or demands or any of those things, but I want to put myself in check when it gets to molding, and when it gets to like manipulating, and when it gets to them being responsible for my response. Like I can be honest about my response. I don't want to get you a blueberry. I'm not going to get it.
Yeah.
I'm mad at you for the way you just said that to me a little bit, and I don't feel like getting you a blueberry right now or something.
Yeah.
But not like, so if you want a blueberry, here's the way you're going to ask for it or something like that. That's where I want to put myself in check, and be honest about my reaction and let them take their own lessons if they want to.
Yes, absolutely. And trust that like the wisdom of the nature of our beings is like gonna process all that information, and it doesn't have to be this manipulative thing.
Yeah. So if we're still kind of on this issue of conformity, and that like this issue of conformity, which is a big part of the essay, I'm going to read one more passage about conformity that for me also segues into the next topic, which I wanted to talk about, which is more of what we would call radical honesty. It truly demands something godlike in him who has cast off the common motives of humanity and has ventured to trust himself for a taskmaster. So this is what we're supposed to be tasked with. This is what society expects us, but I'm trusting myself as the taskmaster. That's what I want for my son. I want his internal compass to be a stronger director for him than I am or anyone else in his life. High be his heart, faithful his will, clear his sight, that he may in good earnest be doctrine, society, law to himself. So like, again, that inner compass is your own doctrine, your own society, your own law, that a simple purpose may be to him as strong as iron necessity is to others. Most men have bound their eyes with one or another handkerchief and attached themselves to some of these communities of opinion. This conformity makes them not false in a few particulars, authors of a few lies, but false in all particulars. Their every truth is not quite true. That idea is just like when you're just conforming, when you're just reciting other doctrines, really in some way everything you're doing is not really your truth. And it's better to be false in a few particulars. It's better to be authors of a few lies than accept someone else's truth or some other indoctrinated truth.
He even uses the words like a paid person or something, or it's like being a lawyer where you're committed to one point of view already.
Yeah.
And so really nothing it's not about truth at that point. It's about supporting that belief system or one or point of view.
Yeah. So these are some of the ideas that I thought really overlapped with radical honesty and maybe a good way to bring us out. He says, thoughtless people contradict as readily the statement of perceptions as of opinions. So that means people who, in his opinion, aren't really thoughtful, they'll contradict a statement of perceptions as much as they will opinions. This gets to what we talk about in radical honesty, where most of us are so busy analyzing, interpreting, categorizing what we pick up with our own senses that we're kind of out of touch with perceptions, and that there is no distinction between opinions and perceptions. Or rather, much more readily, for they do not distinguish between perception and notion. They fancy that I choose to see this or that thing, but perception, this kind of, using his term, God-given ability of our eyes and ears and nose and touch to interact with the outside reality world. Perception is not whimsical. If I see a trait, my children will see it after me, and in course of time, all mankind, though it may chance that no one has seen it before me. For my perception is as much a fact as the sun. So, This is just about distinguishing persons
And
from content.
I loved that part also too, Tony. It's such a crucial part of radical honesty that we practice making the distinction between um, I think what Emerson is saying as perception, we would call a noticing, like being able to notice something with your senses. That is reality. That is truth. And that is very different than a notion, which is a thought, an interpretation, that which is all imaginary. So we can make a distinction between true and imaginary by really using our senses to actually stay in touch with perceptual reality.
Yeah. And radical honesty a lot is about how, a lot of the trouble and upset we create, it comes from these thoughts. It doesn't come as much from our interaction with the world. It says, if you can love me for what I am, we shall be the happier. If you cannot, I will seek to deserve that you should. I will not hide my tastes or aversions. I will so trust that what is deep is holy, that I will do strongly before the sun and moon whatever inly rejoices me, and the heart appoints.
Mm-hmm.
There's a prayer that
I wrote exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I just doing a hand heart because I love it so much.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So there's a prayer that Fritz Perls wrote that Brad kind of bastardized that we end at pretty much every radical honesty meeting session with, that is just really just this same message. We don't need to repeat it right now, but it's about not living up to each other's expectations. And if we get together, it's awesome. If not,
Yeah, I even thought of at my next radical honesty meetup of reading this paragraph instead of doing the Gestalt prayer, because it's like it is the Gestalt prayer.
Yeah.
In different words.
Yeah. So I know Kara has to go, but then is this section about the rose that I mentioned earlier that it satisfies its nature in all moments, but man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him in the moment, stands tiptoe to foresee the future. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present above time. So just using this, Brad talks about being as dumb as a dog or something like that. And this is just like about being as dumb as a rose.
And that rose metaphor is so relevant for children, because they're changing so much all the time and going through all these different stages of development. I think we're pretty focused on kind of tiptoeing over the fence to see the future of them being an adult and and I think it's fine for us to think, well, what I am doing now is going to have an impact on them as an adult, but it's like hurrying them too much into being in a more mature or a different stage of development than they are is we're not appreciating the rose in all of its forms, the seed, the bud, the beginning to flower, the end of the flowering, that all of those different stages have their own beauty. And, and also knowing as a parent that this too shall pass. And it's just, they're just going to keep developing and changing forever, where we'll never catch up.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one last passage I'm going to read that I think Emerson kind of tips his hat as kind of like what he views as like a core truth of this essay. And it's this passage where he says, when good is near you, when you have life in yourself, it is not by any known or accustomed way. You shall not discern the footprints of any other. You shall not see the face of man. You shall not hear any name. The way, the thought, the good shall be wholly strange and new. It shall exclude example and experience. So He's just saying, like, our body recognizes this stuff not because, and our mind, our soul recognizes this stuff not because it's been taught to us before, but because it resonates with the wisdom that has evolved into us from the universe. Brad talks about the wisdom of kids, where they'll like watch something happen, a plane fly across the sky, or a bug crawl across the concrete, and like grok it for the first time. And I think this might have been borrowed from Earhart, but he talks about how you never see it again in that same way. You never see that bug in that same way. The next time you see it, it's in relation to that past time that you saw it. And there's something really special about opening ourselves up to experiencing things like we are for the first time, rather than always in relation to past experience. I know you have to go. I want to thank, I don't even remember the name of the teacher who first exposed me to this essay. It was a freshman, like honors history teacher that I had in school. And I just want to thank her, even though I don't even remember her name, and thank any teacher out there that just shares stuff with us that they don't know how much it like impacts us moving forward.
Yeah, well, yeah, this essay changed your life.
Yeah, I think so.
I wonder if you could find her and tell her. That would be so cool.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that these teachers just know, they don't need to know the specific things they're doing, but it's like this life of service. And when we try and serve, like, we don't need to know the exact things. It's just, we've had so many great teachers. I've been just so lucky to have so many people that have devoted so much of their life to contributing to me and to other children. And I'm so inspired. I created this organization that I do because this is like the change I want to be in the world. And when I've gone and worked like at Montessori schools, we do a lot of work for Montessori schools, and people that work with kids, it's like so inspiring. And it's the one profession that like has me think like, oh, maybe I chose the wrong thing. These people are making such a huge difference. Wow. And so I want to thank people that work with kids, work with your own kids, and work with other kids and teachers. And I'm proud of us for putting this effort into it. And I hope that we share some of this with other people, and that it helps make a difference for them too.
Oh man. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, big love to all the parents and teachers and grandparents and aunts and uncles and everybody who cares about children and supporting them, nurturing them.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Thank you for following the Radical Honesty podcast. I don't know what's coming up next for us. Do you, Kara? Do you know what you want to review next?
I have a couple ideas, but I guess we'll have to talk about it. Yeah.
So we'll put some links below, including a link to Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a few of the other things that we talked about today. But thank you, Kara, for joining me. Thank you to everybody for listening. You can tune into us at the Radical Honesty webpage, now also on Denver Open Media, 92.9, 89.3 HD3 radio in Denver. And we'll be back next week for another episode of the Radical Parenting Podcast.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Bye-bye.